Good morning, everyone, and welcome. The Future of Health Data Summit is probably one of my favorite days of the year. I really enjoy the conversations that we're able to have here. And I'm very thrilled this year to start the conversation with such an important topic as registries and research, and with such an esteemed group of panelists. And to keep the conversation pretty broad, I'd like to define registries for us fairly broadly too, as a means of collecting data in an organized way to answer one or more scientific or clinical questions. So to get us started, I'm actually going to let the panel introduce themselves and also share their experiences with registries in their careers, which I'm sure there have been many. So we'll start with Andy and then go down the line.
Well, good morning. I'm Andy von Eschenbach, and many of you know me as the former commissioner of the FDA and the director of the National Cancer Institute. But actually, most importantly, I'm a clinician, a urologic oncologist. So as I look at this issue of patient registries and how critically important they are, I see it through the eyes of a clinician who encounters a patient and begins to acquire data. It's acquisition of that data and aggregation of it into information, and then analysis to the point of knowledge so we know what to do for that patient, and then accumulate it over time so that we create a body of not just knowledge, but wisdom. Patient registries have the capability of doing that at scale, where we can begin to look at all patients in a way that we can derive that knowledge and accumulate that wisdom. So it's a real pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about many of the nuances of what needs to go into an effective patient registry. But at the core of it, it is the key tool for us to be able, at scale, to care for and correct the problems that are plaguing so many of our fellow citizens. So thank you for having me.
Sure. Chris.
All right. Chris Boone. I am now the former Vice President and Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at AbbVie. My last day was actually Friday. Yeah, it's true. And so within our function, though, unlike some of the other HEOR functions you may have seen across the pharmaceutical industry, we do house HEOR, real-world evidence, patient-centered outcomes research, and we also had a function that was focused on sort of bridging the worlds between payers and pharma as far as evidence generation. But for the most part, my foray into patient registries probably started back when I used to work in actual health systems, and I was in the game when we were actually building and implementing EHRs, and then I moved over to the world of nonprofits with American Heart, where we were doing a lot of quality improvement efforts, and now I'm on the world of research. So really, I hope today our conversation sort of talks about bridging the worlds of clinical care, quality improvement, and sort of longitudinal clinical research. Glad to be here.
My name is Marisa. I'm a vice president of a group called Real World Data Analytics, Innovation, and Partnerships at Bristol Myers Squibb. I've been in this industry for about 37 years, and my experience with registries and real-world data dates from the mid-90s, where the concept or the word big data didn't even exist. So I was working for a company that was really a leader in understanding patient-level data, de-identified patient-level data, and amass an enormous amount of knowledge that drove quality of care in the end-stage renal disease. So we not only drive a lot of patient care quality, but also had the opportunity with that data to create an abundance of knowledge about how the disease was treated, how the dialysis facilities could do a little bit better at looking at patient care, and how we look at quality metrics as a way to drive better patient care. So happy to be here with you, and hope it's going to be a robust discussion.
Well, hey, good morning. John Halamka, president of Mayo Clinic Platform. So wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues. For the last 40 years, I've worked on the technology, policy, and cultural change to unify global data. And I could argue that in 2023 to 2024, we're at a magic time. And that is the standards are good enough, the policies nationally and internationally are enabling us to do great things. And COVID caused a cultural change that reduced a lot of competitive barriers. And real-world evidence is the only path forward. So look forward to our discussion.
Excellent. Thanks all. And as we think about the summit here, there's a conversation that we're having here on stage, but we really hope that the discussion here will spur you all to have conversations in this room and beyond. So you were mentioning, John, a little bit about, now is the time for things to change, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the present and maybe past way of how registries were run. So like if I think of registries today and whenever we talk to our clients, we still think of registries as independent, siloed, and sort of separately managed institutions. So however, you're all saying that they contain substantial clinical information. So how can we bridge the gap to go from these siloed, pretty well structured pieces of information to something that could be available to everyone and be useful for more research? And I'll let anyone who wants to take it go from there.
Yeah, I'll start. So when we think about, about the glory days of PCORI, right, and with PCORInet, they had really two mechanisms, if you wish. PCORInet was data, sitting on EMR, and then they have the more patient-focused data, which was kind of sitting on the registries. And I think, let's face it, that was a great idea, required a lot of investments, but the quality of the information and the learnings that we had from those registries were pretty sound. Now, when we try to make it scalable and make it self-funded, that's when it started to break apart, because the reality is we don't have standardization of data across registries. We don't necessarily have systems that are standards across the industry, and we don't have a way to follow the patient longitudinally. If we start bringing registries, the biggest fear that we have from an industry perspective and from the healthcare provider is what happened with the patient consent. And if we start bridging registries, even if we could do it technically, who's accountable for that patient consent? And when we start linking, if we could, data across registries, who's accountable for it? How do we know? And so I think if we think going back, and if we could, bringing back all the registries, I think it would take an enormous amount of money to standardize all of that. I'm not so sure who would, could do it from a cost standpoint, right? Because it requires an infrastructure to even think about consent. I know there are companies that today are trying to solve that challenge, not necessarily at a registry level, but at a much broader level. But in my opinion, I think if we were thoughtful enough back when we started registries to think about the issue of the consent for the long haul, that will be probably a little easier. But I think for me is moving forward. Can we think about the uses, the type of uses, all type of uses of the patient, the data that we collect from the patient, and can we overcome the consent issue?
So I imagine each of us have our own biases. So having worked this for 40 years, I think of data as having depth, the different kinds of data types, breadth, the number of patients, and spread, the heterogeneity, geography, socioeconomic representation, education, et cetera. It is really hard, as you look at national and global scale, to centralize anything. And what I have seen in my 3 years at Mayo is a federated, decentralized approach where every data generating entity is responsible for consent. And there are rules of the road and governance for bringing the data together and how it's used, who uses it, et cetera. That works because it overcomes the hardest barrier, psychology.
So essentially what you're saying is if we were to build a registry today, from all the things that we've learned over the past decades of registry research, you'd build something that's more federated, where everybody who is responsible for enrolling certain participants is also responsible for managing their consent and managing their wishes as they're part of the registry. So there's the individuals and their consent, and there's also a component about the data that is either actively or passively collected into these registries. And Chris, I know you think a lot about real-world data and where these sources come from. Any thoughts about what should be included in a registry in a way that perhaps hasn't happened before?
You know, it's funny. I mean, as I'm listening to the group, first thing, let me say, Marisa made me think of something. I sit on the board of governors for PCORI, and any opinion that I have is my own and not reflective of PCORI. Let me say it for the official record. But I'll also say this. I think it's interesting because when I think about registries, I don't know how I would even define that term anymore. You know, roughly, 15 years ago when I was at the American Heart Association, we defined it as a disease-based registry that was focused on generating quality improvement data and benchmarking for physicians. That was sort of the benefit of participating in our program. And at that time, we struggled a lot with standardization as far as clinical vocabulary, standardization as far as how they were actually documenting their experiences with many of the patients. And so it created, in many respects, to this idea of heterogeneity is what we struggled with. But if you fast forward to where we are now, there's this whole concept of multimodal data registries, if you want to use that term. And we're looking to incorporate more of the different types of data that happen outside of the clinical care environment. And so I think for us, as John mentioned, for a pharmaceutical or manufacturer, there's always particular interest in multinational, multi-regional, trying to get as wide as you possibly can, because all of that data is not captured in a trial, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is longitudinality. So even for the participants you have in a trial, you do care about the pull-through, right? And tracking them over the long term. So I think that for me, I don't know how you define a registry in sort of a very narrow, it seems like we're using a very narrow definition. So I feel like we need to go back and sort of redefine what exactly is a registry in today's world, next generation, and what does it effectively look like. But it's still fundamentally, you still have that issue of trying to figure out what exactly are you trying to answer, right? What is the actual core question that you're trying to get to? Otherwise, we're just amassing a lot of data that won't be used. And I can guarantee that because we've actually run many studies where we thought, we've had data vendors come to us and say, hey, we have 1 million patients with disease X. But then once we apply any sort of criteria to that data, it may end up being like 500 patients out of that 1 million, right? So I think the more we can get to depth and spread, to John's point, the better off we'll be.
Well, Vera, one of the problems, of course, we've been struggling with for a long time has been this issue of integration and interoperability. We've been building a data transportation system, but everybody using a different gauge track. So you could not get that interoperability. But the good news is, I think crisis gave us opportunity, and that crisis was COVID. And with COVID, we did begin to see the kind of federation that John's talking about, where people were beginning to agree to common data elements, to beginning to agree to methodologies for interoperability. And I think Datavant played an extremely important role in much of that work that was sponsored by the Reagan-Udall Foundation in enabling and helping the FDA to begin to understand what was occurring in that COVID world. And the only way you could do that was with patient registries and real-world data. So there were no opportunities for prospective long-term trials. So I think there's good news in the way that the entire ecosystem is moving to the kind of interoperability and integration that Marisa found so frustratingly absent at the beginning.
So I'm hearing a lot of kind of like the challenges of the past have been challenges of opportunity in a sense, but also challenges of logistics on how these registries were put together. And Jen, you mentioned earlier that now is the time that things are different. So we're hearing a little bit, the pandemic made things different for a lot of us, but what else is different today than wasn't even a couple of years ago?
Sure, so since I worked on this for so many decades, what do we have that's pretty unique today? We've recorded data digitally. It is not just taking OCR of PDFs or other bad things, right? So that is, there's multiple data types that are natively digital. So great, we have the data. The compute is now a commodity, right? And so a couple of weeks ago, Mayo wanted to develop a new model. We needed 20,000 TPUs to run for 3 weeks. No problem. Under $100,000, click a button, done. Right? The compute wasn't there before. And then the tools. We have many more tools at our disposal, and whether those are predictive or generative AI or data merging tools, FHIR, OMOP, et cetera, the tools are finally good enough.
That's excellent to know and then to hear. And I think another thing that I kind of heard you all hint at is the global nature of potentially the future of registries. A small local registry is representing a certain patient population, but that might not be necessarily translatable to the rest of the world or to patients who might care and need those insights. So how are you thinking about the global nature of collecting data?
I think generally it goes back to what, again, the primary purpose of that data collection and what evidence generation you're seeking to use it for. I mean, one of the trends that we've seen happen, at least from a manufacturer's perspective, is that it used to be that you could actually generate data in the US and we would be able to go to every other market or country in the world and say, hey, here, regulator, here's the evidence that we generated from this trial that happened in the US, and they would make their decision based on that submission. Now you're finding that many of the countries are deciding that they want those studies to be run on their own populations. We're also seeing the same thing happening with many of the payers who are saying that we want to see that evidence generated based on our member population and not just what you've done sort of universally, I guess. And so I think that what you're seeing is that this interest in being able to effectively stratify the data in a way where we can get down to age, sex, race, all the social determinants, but also geographies and all of that, and really figuring out what the outcomes are for those particular patients. Now, that's from a research perspective, right? But I think that if we're not thinking about registries with research in mind, I mean, to me, it's almost a moot point, because really it's about continuous learning and innovation. And we hope that getting to in the spirit of a learning healthcare system, that we can get to the point where there is that continuous feedback loop that's happening real time. And one of the challenges to your earlier question is around sort of the shortcomings of registries, is that they were always so retrospective and retroactive, right? I mean, we would collect this data for 24 months, 36 months, or whatever. We run this study, but at the same time, the world is still moving, right? I do think that one of the points that's been raised consistently is this pandemic catalyst is what I'll refer to it as. And I do think that the biggest benefit, well, let me not even say that. One of the silver linings, if there was a silver lining with the pandemic, is that there was I think a societal shift in the way we think about data sharing. If you were to ask people pre-pandemic if they were willing to share their data, only people that you really found were the patient advocates who were very focused on altruism and really finding a cure for whatever disease that they're dealing with. But if you go to it now, people sort of see how the practicality of sharing data and why it's so important. That is actually one of the biggest hurdles that we had, was around the issue of consent and what exactly are you doing with the data. But I think there's now sort of common knowledge, if you will, on why we want to collect that data and what we're trying to do with it.
I think, sorry to be the dumper of the excitement, but my team is the one that evaluates potential partnerships and different companies that may have access to the data that we need for research purposes, both in the US and ex-US. And I have to say, when it comes down to Europe, you would think that many companies have a single patient identifier. Many countries have a single patient identifier and collect massive amount of data. And that's true, but that data is not readily available. That the data across countries is not standardized, is not interoperable. And what we found that even when companies try to be kind of the data aggregator and so on and so forth, it is a nightmare to have access to the data that we need for research purposes. So it's data that was collected by healthcare institutions for their purposes, which is improve standard care, but not necessarily for research purposes. And what we found is that we spend an enormous amount of time working with those providers of data to helping them understand how to think about the data elements that we need for research purposes. And the reality is, like Chris was saying, we evaluate, I don't know how many, potential partners, whether it be healthcare institutions or whether it be aggregators. And at the end of the day, of the tens of millions of patient data that they have, we may get 500 that remotely satisfies the need for research. So, and to me, I think registries is not just necessarily, like Chris said, for research purposes, but for knowledge, increase our knowledge about a disease or treatments and so on and so forth. But that knowledge is only possible if we start bringing those data together. And having worked with partners in Europe and trying to identify paths to data access in Europe is just nearly impossible to actually get there anytime soon.
Yeah, but I think there are a couple things going on here, and you may recall that a while back the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe, looking at Alzheimer's, used patient registries as a foundational piece, not the entire piece. So the point there was the registries were crude, if you will, but they served as a way of creating a foundation from which you could derive cohorts that would be then more refined with regard to their data elements, and then finally a level even beyond that, where from the cohorts, industry could then select groups of patients for clinical trials that were very disciplined. So I think the first point of that is that we ought to put registries into a context. And it's the context that creates a hierarchy till we get to that ultimate refinement that maybe a regulator needs. The other side of it, it gets back to the point John made, is that I think when we start thinking about next generation patient registries, we'll go far beyond that frustrating initial crude just gathering up. Because I think there are tools that are coming into play where you can begin to characterize every patient in that registry, almost create their own individual barcode. And then by doing that, you begin to be able to utilize that registry for analytics in, I think, a more sophisticated way. So we may want to talk about some of those tools, but I really think you struck on it, that registries are critically important. They're crude and useful as a foundation. Now we need to refine them, but there's more to it in those other hierarchies.
Yeah,
So it's
for
a
sure.
foundational, necessary as a foundation, but not sufficient. So as you go into sub-stratify the patients there, then augment data on those patients so you actually can use them for the studies that you were mentioning, Marisa, correct?
So let me offer an alternative suggestion.
Sure.
Try to be edgy here. So during COVID, it was March of 2020, and a certain political figure, unnamed, will say hydroxychloroquine is good for you. And nobody knew. Do we do an RCT? How do we figure this out? So what we said is, could we get 2,400 hospitals to contribute data and case-matched data with specific criteria about patients who received that med? And we had to define variables like ventilator days. What's a ventilator day? And look temporally at, when was hydroxychloroquine given? When did intubation happen? When did discharge or death occur? In 2 weeks, we were able to assemble the data of 2,400 sites and determine that hydroxychloroquine is really bad for you. And so the question is, we think next generation, as we look at federated models, there are many approaches. Real-world evidence that's purpose gathered in very short time at very low cost is possible.
And John, I know you've worked at creating an international platform, a clinical platform for research. So if we're taking some of the challenges that we're hearing about here, how do you actually go about building that full barcode of the patients when there's different rules and regulations in different countries and different jurisdictions? And frankly, even within the US, like different states have different rules and regulations about privacy.
Right. So our approach, again, right or wrong, this is just one approach, is to say if we can take a standard schema, in this case we call it OMOP Prime, I mean, it's Odyssey based, and we've added a variety of elements for things like genomics, digital path, et cetera, and you go to a country and say, oh, what are your local regulations? Those may have things like data residency or sovereignty, de-identification may be defined in a certain kind of way. So you de-identify and tokenize, and you put it in a standard schema, and you get then country-level agreement that data never leaves their country, data is never sold or exfiltrated, but partners and collaborators can come into a controlled environment and then run a study on that data and leave with the results. That, so far, I mean, Mayo assembled a lot of North America, South America, I mean, we did Canada, we did Israel, and this next couple of months, Europe and Asia. So it's starting.
Is there a place that's been more challenging than others, or are you seeing some of the same challenges everywhere?
Well, every country has their own challenges. I mean, there are certain countries in Europe that, I won't name the country, that...
We don't know.
Yeah. When I talked to the health minister said, the cloud, how do you lock it at night? So
Very carefully.
Yeah, so there's certain kinds of risk tolerance that you need, and certain countries in Asia, same kind of risk intolerance. But generally, I mean, it's a Gaussian distribution. Early adopters are suddenly getting the middle adopters, which will get to the late adopters.
So generally, there's some adaptability to this new way of doing registries. Does the rest of the group have any alternatives? Like there's the federated model, other alternatives?
But I have a question for Chris, because you know, you think about a patient registry and an individual, it's almost an infinite number of variables that you could begin to think about. And yet there may be just a core of those variables that are critically important. So as industry looks at registries as a way of identifying patients for trials and enriched trials, are there a core set of elements that we can all agree to and define?
That's a great question. I feel like that's a statement and a question all wrapped in one. I don't know. I wouldn't say that there is a core. I think that we're very much in an exploratory phase. One of the biggest opportunities you have, is to your point, is like biomarker identification for many of the therapies, but also as you do this idea of identifying patients that would actually be eligible for a trial. As I think about registries, and you just hit on one of the use cases, or next generation registries, it's the use of that type of data that would actually help you identify who those patients are based on whatever predefined criteria that we've established. Now, a lot of that is going to vary according to the disease, according to the trial itself, and all these other things, and whatever study protocol we've developed. So it's hard to say that there is a core that you would always look for consistently. But what I will say is that the idea, the concept of doing it should be sort of standardized, if you will. And that's what I mean. So as we think about this whole idea of next generation patient registries, and in my head, all I can think about is I'm listening to all the other panelists is that, well, technically everything is a registry these days. The issue that we have, and from my perspective, is the sort of unification of all the data, of all of that, unification of quality data, right? There's a ton of data out there, but all of it's not useful. That's the key point. And so how do you get, but ask yourself why. And a lot of it is because, honestly, clinical guidelines are different, clinical pathways are different within healthcare, but all these things are the differences between running a randomized clinical trial and effectively generating RWE. It's much more controlled. We know exactly what the clinical protocol is. We know exactly how that data is being collected. There are no missing data elements, and all of these other challenges that we see in the real world. Honestly, you can unify all the data you want, and it won't be useful to anybody to generate the evidence that we need to make the decisions, whether they be policy, regulator, or whatever. And I think that if there's a greater focus on creating sustainability in these registries that are addressing these issues of standardization, you notice I'm not emphasizing interoperability because I don't find that to be as greater challenge as some of the other things that we're seeing, right? What we have now is that I have, a host of different data providers saying, hey, we have data that can do this. But to me, that data is useless if it's not unified with this other data source, right? And so, and honestly, and then we get into some philosophical questions on how do you best address the issue of interoperability. Some people say that it starts with the patient. It starts with using health data or Apple Health Kit and being able to essentially move the data with us. Other people will say that you can't rely on patients to do that. So it becomes I think that these are a lot of questions to be addressed as we move forward, but I don't think it's as simple as applying a legacy definition of patient registries to now a current environment where we now have many advancements in digital technologies, whether it be cloud computing, whether it be AI, ML, NLP, you name it, right? And so I think all of these things are what contribute to the differences in what a legacy registry used to be and where we are today.
But I think, Andrew, you actually brought an interesting point, and the same can be said for clinical research, right? So when you think about, protocols for a specific disease and so on and so forth, there's certain things that you go, okay, this should be standard, right? Yeah. Well, the reality is you'll be surprised when you look at protocols for a similar disease or therapeutic area or whatever, how much variability there are in things that you go, how many ways do we have to define pregnancy, for God's sakes, right? So, well, it looks like in our case we had 12, right? So things that come that seem logical, when you look at across the board how clinical trials or registries or phase 4s have been developed over time, it was based on who was writing the protocol and the previous protocols that were written, and everybody had their own ways of defining certain elements. So to answer your question, I think, yes, there are certain components of registries that should be standardized because those are the elements that are normally captured in the normal practice of medicine. There are certain things, like Chris said, that is very specific to what is the question that you're trying to answer in that particular registry. But you would think that those are 20% or 25 or 30% of the elements, not 90% of the elements. And that's what we did with clinical trials and registries and so on and so forth. We have so many variables or so many definitions that any attempt to link will not yield the results that we are hoping for, like Chris said.
Well, Vera, it's been 20 minutes and we haven't said the word generative AI.
I was just looking at the time.
Amazing,
see how far
isn't
we make it.
And so here's an interesting question. I would argue that 80% of the value of the data we collect is in the unstructured text. And in traditionally, what Mayo has done is NLP and knowledge graphing, extracting the unstructured data into structured data elements. Peter Lee of Microsoft, not to endorse any product or service, and I gave a keynote last week, and he said, the future is going to be generative AI being the data analyst, where you will in fact say, now go look at this giant corpus of mess and tell me what, for this kind of patient and this kind of sign or symptom, what are you seeing? Who knows? Maybe yes, maybe no. Auditability going to be a little hard, but that's something at least keep in the back of our mind. The new tools may give us new opportunity.
Well, John, from that standpoint, can AI be a Rosetta Stone? Marisa's talked about the fact that how many different ways we have of defining pregnancy. Could AI just look at that and say, it doesn't matter which word you're using, I know what it means? Well, you were talking about tools before, and I'm anxious to know, so where can AI help?
Well, and I think that's true. So, I give you a case example from Mayo. Again, March 2020, and we said, I wonder if we can predict who's going to have a positive COVID PCR test. Is it sore throat? Is it fever? Is it fatigue? And it turned out when we started to run AI across all this unstructured text, it was loss of smell and taste, which was a completely random finding that we wouldn't have even looked for. So sure, these new techniques give us new power.
Yeah, so I could actually see kind of both sides of the argument here, like AI as a catch-all way to solve a lot of problems, and AI also as a way to augment some of the problems that we see. So on one hand, I see AI as a way to democratize how research can be done. You don't need to be a data analyst to ask a question in plain English and get an answer back in plain English or whatever language you're using as a researcher. On the other hand, I also worry about a couple of things. So depending on what data you're feeding into these models, you're going to get results that will be biased on those data. And depending on how you control the model, you might also have some privacy implications. So how do we think about balancing those opportunities to potentially things that we need to watch out for?
Yeah, I think AI could help in many, many ways, right? Let me tell you the ways in which I don't think it will help, which is it won't help with lack of quality data, right? Because then you're feeding data that is just not good, and it will give you the wrong answer. So that's when people get all excited about, let's do AI. Well, we don't do AI. The AI is a tool that we use for a specific purpose, whether it be to, identify a patient population that we're interested in, or it could help us, especially in industry, it could help us with expert determination, right? Today, we have to, extract the data, pack the data, ship it, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, find the expert determination. I think what Datavant is doing with Mirador could be phenomenal, because then, or in the combination with SciOx, is you get the data out of the native system, and then you curate on the spot. So all of a sudden you get the data that you need and the quality that you need. You don't have to be the sponsors don't have to be the data quality police, and AI could be fantastic for that. Or even risk detection, right? By the statistical methods, those are the ones where AI can do a phenomenal job at helping us with things that take very, very long time now.
That's a great point.
I think, sort of building on that point, the data quality issue is still paramount, right? I mean, I think there's no way to get around it. Garbage in, garbage out. We know that rule. But I also think the biggest issue that we have, in addition to the audibility issue that John raised, is explainability and reproducibility, right? For us, if we can't replicate a study that was done and get the same result, it's going to create problems. And I think that as we continue to move forward, that's the biggest challenge you have with applying AI to at least generate RWE. Now, we do use certain AI techniques in order to help with unstructured data that's in text fields and all these other things, and we've been doing that for years, right? But when it actually comes to the analysis of that data to produce or generate RWE that would be used for decision making, there's no way we could in the current state. So that's a challenge to be addressed. I also think too that one of the things that we have is that we also generate a lot of RWD too, believe it or not, because we have many patient support programs that we have, and we're usually routinely collecting patient-reported outcomes on their experiences with many of the therapies that we generate. I think one of the biggest issues that I have with EHRs as being sort of the primary source of data for a lot of these decisions is that, honestly, I always say there's a forgotten population. There are people in this country that actually do not go to the doctor at all. And many of them are in these rural areas, many of them are in these impoverished areas. And so then we get into a sort of a representation issue or a representative challenge. So while we're creating these large language models and these AI models to generate evidence, you still have a whole segment of the population that's not being reflected in many of those models, which also introduce additional biases, right?
I think there was a point made earlier, I think by Marisa, about data that is collected but siloed somewhere, maybe in another part of the world where you are not able to access it. But there's also data that's not being collected at all, that's not showing up in the medical system, Chris, which is what you're referring to. So going back to AI as potentially a way to democratize science, do you see how technology can help a researcher look at registry data and say, hey, you're missing a specific patient population, or this data is going to be biased because, and watch out for XYZ? Like, do you see that becoming part of the canon of science?
So what we've done, again, not right or wrong, is that we look at social determinants of health, and much of the social determinants of health data is sparse or not granular. And so you ask, well, can I really understand the data set I'm working with? We created something called the Houses Index, where we took every latitude and longitude in the United States, mapped every grocery store, Superfund site, crime and educational opportunity statistics, primary care, et cetera, some 40 different variables. So based on your latitude and longitude, I can infer 40 data elements about you. And that can be used to a bit more understand the underlying data set, as well as to correct for bias. And you are absolutely correct. We have to meet the patients at their level of technological comfort and literacy, because we aren't gathering a whole variety of patient data today.
But I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I mean, the point that I think we're getting to is that there's been so much focus on the digital divide. I would actually call it the data divide, right? For the people who are not being reflected in many of the data sets that we're using to do all of the analysis we care about. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Vera, I think the point that I wanted to share was back where I started. The ability to create this next generation of patient registries where there is the much more refinement, it presents an enormous opportunity for us to look at the ends of the bell-shaped curve and the distribution across the population. And I was always fascinated as a clinician between the two ends of a Kaplan-Meier curve. Those people who failed immediately versus those that seemed to do well forever. What was unique about those that would give me insights into the disease process? And I think patient registries give us the platform where we begin to be able to see the variance and be able to look for what those clues are that are at very far ends of the bell-shaped curve. And I think that's really important for regulators, because that's the problem, right? It's the variance and heterogeneity in any population, even a well-defined clinical trial. And so patient registries may give us the opportunity to get that kind of insight. And I think it could be a great tool for not just adverse events, but unusual, efficacious outcomes that give us the clue to the next opportunity for discovery.
That's wonderful. That's fantastic. And time flies when you're having fun, and we're having such a great conversation, and I'd love to continue this conversation. So I will wrap up this panel by asking you guys one more question, which is more of a hint to the rest of the attendants of the summit. There's folks in this room and outside who are probably going to build registries, or who are researchers who will be using registry data. What is one thing that you'd want to impart as they're building these next generation registries, and what conversations would you want to happen in the hallways of this hotel today? We'll start here and then go down the line.
Wow, what a great question. So I would argue that the future is not a giant registry in the basement of the White House run at nation scale. It is going to be distributed, federated, based on multiple data sources, sort of point one. Point two, everyone has said data quality is so important. Understand the provenance, who gathered the data, for what purpose, and how much you can trust it. And then only be limited by your imagination, because the next generation of tools will take images, telemetry, and text and process it in novel ways.
I would say, the registry of the future is, like John alluded to, is federated. It takes a village. It will be a combination, a collaboration between those who have the relationship with the patient and can extract and curate data that is available and curated on the spot and is dynamic and can answer the questions that we need. But we will need the folks that are close to the patient, the aggregators, and then technology players that can actually make it happen.
I think the imparting wisdom I would give is start with the end in mind. I think that the registry will definitely be multimodal. It'll certainly be longitudinal. It'll certainly be representative of all the different populations, and honestly creates the, as I described earlier, the continuous feedback loop of knowledge generation that we need to make clinical care decision making, but also research decisions as well.
Yeah, I think with next generation patient registries, the acquisition and aggregation is not going to be the issue. It's going to be the analytics to the point where we know. So I'm looking forward to what the p-value and the hazard ratio elements can be in patient registries so that we know and we can rely upon that knowledge and make regulatory and policy decisions.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, as I see it, whenever there's a challenge, there's an opportunity to innovate. And I am so glad to be on stage here with this group of folks who's doing just that in your respective fields. So thanks, everyone. And please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.